out across all of our, oh, no worries. Yeah, as we roll IIIF out across the Getty, some of the things that we've been thinking about and to try to get some insight from the rest of you. As a bunch of you probably know, Getty is a very complicated organization that does many, many different things. It's a museum and a library and an archive. It's also a publisher. We do a lot of conservation work. We have a website. And all of these parts of the Getty create and use images. Some parts of our organization really think about objects. When we think about the library or the archive or the museum in particular, it's a very object-focused perspective on what we do. But when we think about our website or we think about our publications, they think about images in a way that is different than the way that our core cultural heritage collection-based institutions do. And often what this means is that images that the Getty has captured are used in multiple contexts. Here we have our core museum collection website that has an image of this Lorenzo Lotto drawing. We also have a book in which that is one of the images contained within that book. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Getty has committed very thoroughly to IIIF, which means that we get to run into all sorts of fun edge cases as we try to figure out what it means to be a very IIIF focused organization. So this is what the homepage of getty.edu looks like as of this morning. All of the images that you see here are coming through our IIIF infrastructure. The hero image, the display images for our talks. And what that means is that we're using IIIF in many, many contexts beyond just the museum's collection. And so to start with, everything that I want to talk about here is part of the IIIF spec. This isn't a proposal for extensions or changing what we've done. IIIF is a really nice way to think about these problems. What I'm really thinking about here is, in practice, how do we use the spec and what does that mean for the organizational structure that we have and the way that we deal with the content that we're creating? So pulling from the IIIF presentation 3 documentation, we talk a lot about 2 core resources. One is the manifest and the other is the canvas. Manifests are compound objects and canvases are individual views of an object. So if we think about this, what this is saying in many ways is that we treat manifests as proxies for objects, and we think canvases as proxies for views, or as documentation or as data structures that represent those views. And so as we think through what this means, I want to think through some of the different use cases that we've seen and how those are affected by what we're doing here. First, the absolute canonical IIIF implementation is images as a proxy for a book. It's where IIIF came out of, from manuscripts and libraries. You have this idea that you have a sequence of images. They are intrinsically ordered. In almost all cases, there's only one real clear order for those pages. And the pages don't make a lot of sense outside of the context of that particular object. So it works really, really well in the IIIF context. The secondary context that we tend to run into things here are things like paintings, drawings, works on paper, where there's very often a main object, which works very well as a proxy or representation of that object. Though there are often other images that are taken of that and are often packaged with that are documentation of that. But as we continue into some of we also have sculptures. Sculptures images aren't as good a proxy for a sculpture as they are as they would be for a painting. They're three-dimensional. We end up with lots and lots of representations of the object. But this series of images of a sculpture aren't a great they don't capture the three-dimensionality of the object. They don't really capture the object at all. They represent it really well. But this package of things doesn't have the same relationship to the real world object as, say, it would for a painting. And it gets even fuzzier when we start working in the archives, because we have images that, like many people, we don't catalog our archives consistently at the item level. We often do it at the folder or the box level. And so what we have here is a series of images that are a proxy for the contents of a folder, but aren't really proxies for the objects within the folder. And so we have a manifest here, which has a couple of envelopes, a couple of letters. They're all bunched together in sequence because that's what's in that folder. But nobody looking at this image would say, oh, this is a folder. They see letters. And as we start getting further away from that core collecting use case, we end up more and more into things like publication comparable configs. So here we have two images that are presented in a context. We've got them as, it is a ordered sequence of images that helps present in a context, but they're not related except that they're part of that conceptual grouping of images. They go together, but they go together in the context of this particular publication. And as we go to things like search results, where we're using these images as proxies for web pages that describe objects, this is even further away from that grouping of objects. We're also using IIIF for our image carousels. And this is a group of objects that are conceptually related because they're a list of images that represent our current display choices for free publications on our website. It's really easy to represent this as a manifest, but it's not an object, except if we want to think about that presentation context as being something, a conceptual set. We are also using these images just as editorial content. The hero page on a website. This is a picture of an artwork in our collection, but we're not using it in any way that cares about the fact that this is a collection object. This is a pretty picture that helps tell a story on that web page. It's editorial. And we also end up with sort of novel experiences where we are caring about the images, but we're caring about them as data, as images, as collections of pixels that we want to do something. So we haven't run into any case in which we can't use IIIF to implement these features. IIIF is used in all of these features and works quite well. What we've run into is that manifests only make sense in some of these contexts. That idea that what we have is a representation of a compound object gets very, very fuzzy here. And in IIIF, we have that image API, which is a really good way to access the pixels and the underlying data about the visual representation of an image. And we have the presentation API, which talks about manifests and canvases. But where we start getting really complicated is when we start adding in annotations here, because you can't annotate an image in the image API. You can only annotate a canvas in the presentation API. And in particular, that gets complicated when we want to do annotations and then reuse those annotations as the images themselves are used in multiple contexts. And so some of the observations that I found as we've thought through this is that manifests are there are manifests that we want to use that are transient presentations, objects in a specific context. The configs are a good example of this. Search results are a good version of this. This came up in the discussion we were just having. I also know I've seen this in a IIIF interface, but I couldn't find it while making these slides. But that shopping cart interface where people really want to go through and select a set of images for download, for view within a viewer, manifests work really well in this context. It's not that hard to create a manifest. But what we'd like to do in many cases is include some of the annotations that are associated with those images in this new transient collection. And what we've heard pretty regularly from our users is that when they do this, they're often looking to collect images, not to collect objects. They want this image of the artwork, and then this image of another artwork, and then this image of something from the archives, and they want to see those together. Not necessarily, they'd like to be able to get back to the object, but they're not necessarily trying to talk about, they're not trying to curate a set of objects the way that a museum would put together an exhibition. They're looking at images. The other observation is that these images appear in many contexts. And the annotations that are generated from them are often about the image, not the object. We find this more and more as we start using computational processes to generate metadata. Some of you, and I think there was a lightning talk about this yesterday, about our 12 Sunsets exploration. Again, this is a IIIF enabled experience, but the object that's being represented here is Sunset Boulevard, not any particular archival folder or structure. And each one of these images has been through a computational process. We've generated tags with Google Vision. We've done OCR on it. The OCR that says this image contains the words Tower Records, or I think in this case, Tire Records, since OCR is terrible about weird overlaps, is true in both the 12 Sunsets context and in our archival viewing context. We want to know that that annotation is connected to this image in all contexts. And we also want to know that if we rerun that annotation, that OCR with a better algorithm that gets better results, these results get updated, which means that a manifest that talks about those images in the context of Sunset Boulevard is a different conceptual representation than the image within the context of an archival folder, but the annotations aren't tied to either one of those presentational contexts. They're really tied to this image as an abstract representation of pixels and the data and content contained within that picture. And so I think as we think through this, how do we, using IIIF, manage that kind of data? A third observation that we've ended up making here is that often there is a metadata that is associated with that image, and often that varies across the images within the context of an object. For reasons that predate my time at the Getty, some of the object photography that we have requires a particular photographer's credit to be associated with that image of an object. It's not metadata about the object, it's metadata about the image that needs to be presented when that image is presented in that context. We've also started doing a lot of work around accessibility. This means we've been creating visual descriptions of a lot of images in our collection. Those aren't descriptions of the object, they are descriptions of the image itself. And so they're relevant in any context that image appears and could be useful in that context. And so we'd want that to be carried with the image, not just with the representation of it in the context of a collection object. Alt text is something that we also try to put in many places, and that's often even more presentationally, that's about the image in the context of a particular presentation, not intrinsic in the content of the image. And so we have similar bits of metadata, but some of it go with a presentation, some of it go with an object, and some of it go with an image itself. And we do have those annotations that are that image in context versus image in content. So OCR tends to travel with the image across all instances because that is actually content that appears within the pixels itself. But it's easy to imagine, and we've seen use cases of this, where people want to take a picture of a painting and then annotate on information about that picture, but that we wouldn't want to travel in all contexts that we display that, like conservation reporting. It's really useful to have the tools of IIIF to say, this region of the painting has a scratch in it, but we may not want that to show up every time everyone looks at the image. It's only valid within a particular presentational context. But if we're doing multiple conservation reports, we would want that to travel with every context in that, with every time we show that image, we'd want to show it regardless of the order of that presentation. We've also run into this with computer vision tagging. There are some contexts like 12 Sunsets where we think Google tags are really useful and we'd want them to be part of that metadata package. We've also run into some where the fact that they're wildly wrong and often funny doesn't make sense, like the more archival scholarly context. So the ability to choose which annotations are associated with each image within the context of a presentation is really important. And again, this is not something that IIIF isn't aware of. Canvases are a conceptual space that contains annotations that present a specific collection of content. You know, my read of the spec in all its glories says that canvases are this really abstract space that just happens to often have as the lowest level of annotation an image that completely fills it. There's nothing in the spec says that there has to be an image in a canvas anyway. And as we work with things like media, AV, we start ending up with these imageless canvases anyway. And so as I think through this canvases as conceptual spaces, I start running into questions around how do we manage these canvases as conceptual spaces, as conceptual presentations of an image in a way that isn't just a manifest. So how do we handle these interactions with images and annotations as a package, as a, which is really to say, how do we handle interactions with canvases as a user, not just as manifest as object proxy? There's a lot of use cases where that manifest as object proxy makes a lot of sense, but there's other interactions where it doesn't. How do we think through and keep track of what's intrinsic to the object and what's intrinsic to the image or view? And how do we separate those two pieces of data out? And how do we manage those? Change management is also something here, particularly as we add more and more computer vision processing into our workflows. We know we're going to be going back and augmenting the information about an image regularly. We also know we want to reuse these images in multiple contexts, which really means that the canvas as a concept or as something that is identified is a mutable thing in our ecosystem, which means that often several manifests have to change when a canvas changes. And how do we keep track of those pieces of data? And I think to me, that leads us to what I really wanted to think about with us as a group, which is at this point, when we talk about things like change discovery or any of the authentication, these layers, they're often tied into either the image API or manifests as part of the presentation API. But as we start using canvases more and more, and I anticipate, at least from my use cases, and I'm hoping from others, that there's more work that's going to go into canvases as being something that IIIF cares about. What does it mean for that to be a first-class resource within the IIIF environment? It's not something that isn't in the specs, but it isn't something that I see a lot of in the discourse that we're having. And I think for me, where that really ends up with is when it comes to things like the practical concerns of how do we help people author canvases to choose a set of annotations that are associated with that view, and what language do we put around that? From a technical perspective, how do we handle the fact that our manifests are not going to necessarily be static, but may be generated and modified based on changes to the underlying canvases and the annotations contained within that canvas. And does this affect any of the UX work that we're doing around how we present this and how we aggregate these? Do we need to, is there, in our displays, do we want to have canvas URLs present for individual images within a, say, the view of a sculpture? Or is that a bridge too far? If we want someone to pull in a particular view of something, what does that mean? And so, you know, I don't have answers to these questions, but this is something that if there was ever a group of people that I would love to get insight and other opinions on, this would be the people. And so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and walking through these slides, and I'd love to hear other insights and observations and perspectives on this kind of work. Thank you very much. So at this point, I'm happy to have discussion. I'm also happy to have help facilitating that from people who are better at facilitating Zoom discussions than I am.
Well, first of all, I would say this is all very excellent points. And whenever this kind of discussion arises, and what kind of bothers me is when we talk about like Canvas specific metadata, I find it that's mostly really not about Canvas, but individual images or like annotations. So it's more bound to the annotation or image than the concept of Canvas. So I mean, yeah, that's just one point.
Yeah, I guess for me, the question there is the canvas in many ways a packaging of image plus the metadata about that? Not about a virtual abstract space, but about that association of pixel data plus structured data that represents content that is related to those individual pixels. Robert?
Yeah, I'm starting with the easy part is that I've also been looking at, well, treating Canvas as a separate and addressable object because we are thinking about, well, people doing annotations like transcriptions or machine learning, marking up of images of books. And so our scholars come with a manifest from some images somewhere, and then because you cannot really change the canvas, the manifest of somebody else's presentation, you have to create your own. And on the other hand, and something that is also been mentioned in the other API sessions, is it would be really, really nice if it were possible to also collect information that says, well, somebody else has translated this page of this book, which would be not the manifest, evidently, but the canvas. And for that, the canvas needs to have a globally unique identifier. So at least the praxis I would like to use is to take the canvas ID out of the original manuscript and put them into my manuscript manifest. And yeah, at least that's my main angle about it, about Canvas showing objects. I mean, I work a lot with people from art history and doing photo collections and photo libraries, and there's a whole other slew of questions about what is actually shown. And some people say, oh yes, but this is a very early photograph, and who took this photograph and what paper did they take it on? And other people saying, oh, this shows the Sistine Chapel. I want to see all images about the Sistine Chapel, which goes into depths that I cannot really judge, but at least the thought about, and maybe tools that make it easier to reuse the canvas as a unique identifier for this view of this image, at least at the very simple level.
Hi, just to tack on to that, I had there was a discussion some time ago on the IIIF listserv. I think it was someone from Wikimedia Commons, from Wikimedia, and this topic came up about how to use and reuse canvases. I think from that discussion and from other experience I've had, I think one of the key things to keep in mind is to have a very clear idea of what a canvas actually represents in the real world, and have a very clear contract with both the users and the systems using it. So there is no confusion about what should go, for example, descriptive metadata or technical metadata, what should go in the canvas versus what should go at the manifest level. From my experience, for example, I've always found it easier to designate the canvas as a document, as a visual document, of course, that can have in theory multiple images, which are the different renderings of that document. So that document should say be a photograph, and the manifest containing it could be something else, something like a real world object that can have multiple documents attached to it. That's just one example, but defining exactly what a canvas is meant to represent is very important, when you add layers to your structure.
Yeah, one of the tools that I see being used a lot are collections as a way to, to create user-defined aggregations of objects. But as of right now, I don't think we can put, there's no way to aggregate a set of canvases into something that's a manifest. But I don't know how to, I don't know how to do that from a UX perspective right now, or if that's something that we want to enable from a UX perspective. It makes a lot of sense, and so one of the ways that we've dealt with this, and is to have multiple manifests for varying levels of depth in our representations, to have per image manifests and then per object manifests, and then for the archives, per folder or box level manifests as well, because then each layer of aggregation can then be aggregated into conceptual groupings. But that feels clumsy, and it still doesn't help us deal with the how do we keep track of the annotations in that context.
Is that because of the viewer constraint, like viewer takes only manifest as input?
Yeah, and the conceptual discourse as well. I feel like all of the, at least at this point, there's not a lot of, canvases are implementation detail inside IIIF, not something that we tend to communicate out as something that can be used independently. And I don't know that I want to open the door to yet another level of complexity as we talk through abstract data models with researchers and scholars. So I'm hesitant to say, as a tech nerd, it's like, oh, look, it's another URL. Let's just put another URL on the page and have people understand that Canvas context is different than manifest content. Like, I'm still struggling to get people to understand what a manifest is and how that differs from the web page of the object or the API response of the object. Yet another level of exposing technical mumbo jumbo to people scares me.
Can I ask a question? In the context of archives, so if the Getty is describing a manifest equals folder or box level, and then the individual photographed items within that file or box are then the canvases, have you thought about what adding additional metadata or thinking conceptually more about the items as canvases? Like, do you have ideas of what this would solve? Because I'm trying to process what you're saying, and we have that same issue where we have item level description of a letter, but the letter is actually tied to a file level description or even higher level, like phone level description of what that item belongs to. So right now we are actually representing the letter as a manifest, but I'm interested in the idea of aggregating those. I guess it's just a collection level manifest. Anyway, sorry, do you have ideas of how to solve that issue?
I mean, I think we've run into the same issue, which is that our cataloging practice as of right now is in most cases at the folder or box or some higher level cataloging. But as soon as we run that set of images through, say, an OCR, we end up with image level description, and the image level descriptions, you know, the transcriptions of a multi-page letter are not, you know, data about page 1, data about page 2, data about page 3 as individual items. They really are about a letter that is 3 things. And so we have item level metadata immediately because the computer has generated it, but we don't have a hook for that. And so that is one problem we're definitely struggling with. And we want that metadata, and in particular, we want that metadata to be semantic and not just presentational. The first version we did of our archives was really using IIIF as that representation of all of the, you know, we built manifests out for each one of them, but then we want to run metadata about that through search, and we want to start reusing that data. And the rightful presentation concerns of IIIF led to the fact that it makes that metadata really hard to reuse or to do anything structured with. So we're ending up creating item level records that are super, super stubby and that make the archivist super nervous because there's data about them that doesn't belong in any of our systems. And we have both that problem, and I think the other one, which is what I was thinking about in this presentation, which is even if we create that stub record, there's value in seeing the content of a folder as a IIIF manifest, as well as the content of a letter as a IIIF manifest. But the OCR of a single page belongs to both of those. And when I rerun the OCR on both of those, I want both manifests to update. And so I need to track that canvas, which is that representation of the image plus its metadata somewhere in my system.
At least in the archives context, I wonder, is it less about the canvases and more about the relationships of the manifests being defined in a different way?
I wonder if we can hear about Nikki's point on the chat. I think that's an interesting approach, using annotations to kind of pick out the canvases.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the annotation data structure and pretty much anything out there to actually create annotations, it does include either that canvas information and often the manifest information when you're creating those annotations. So it actually ends up in that data structure. So when I was looking at creating this tool, I thought about, you know, what is going to be best for the users. And I later added in the ability to use the manifest as the data source for annotations. But originally I was just looking at using the annotation because that made the most sense to me in terms of what users could take away and use without having to have like any kind of technical expertise or any kind of knowledge and have even knowing what a manifest is. Like they'd be able to export their annotations from anywhere and just slap it in. And I'm actually working on an application right now that allows you to annotate. Basically, it will allow you to log in with your GitHub account and annotate images, and it will write all those images to your GitHub account. So that also just makes it easier to kind of build out. It doesn't even you don't even have to like edit a manifest.
How do you get the images that you're annotating?
There are multiple ways. You can either use the image API, because what I found from kind of a scan is a lot of institutions don't have the resources to actually have a presentation API set up. All they have is an image API. You can actually use regular images as well, but from a IIIF standpoint, you can use an image API, or you can annotate a manifest. You can load a manifest and annotate that as well. But part of the reason I also went with the annotation as a data source is a lot of institutions really have very sparse resources. So all they can set up is an image API within their, that's all they have the infrastructure for.
Yeah, I know that problem well, because we also have very, yeah, if you start out with a manifest, you have to put something in there, and that can already be a problem of what title, author, whatever, yeah. But in the end, you're writing out something that creates, then your annotation contains then a canvas, or do you link directly to the image API?
Depends on your data source. If you're using a manifest, it will do a canvas and then also add, there's a field with an annotation that allows you to do, I think in W3, it's DC terms within, or no, within I think is the old form. I can't remember the exact fields, but W3 has a specific field and Open Annotation has a specific field that I'm not remembering right now. But both of those load the manifest into the annotation as well as the canvas as the field, which I think is on, but again, I can't remember specific fields right now. So if you're using the manifest as a data source, it will load the canvas along with the manifest information into the annotation. If you're just using an image as a data source, as what you're annotating, it will load that the info.json URL as what you're annotating.
I have a question. I think I'm probably pretty lost at this point conceptually, but if you have an image that needs to be presented in multiple contexts, and that's already embedded in various canvases across various manifests, could you just put the image, could you make a single canvas manifest for that image? Is that something that's like, doesn't make sense, or could it be a potential solution?
I think you could do that. I think we often do that. I think it is that, as an example, we have what I think of as like our collection presentation, which is, you know, these 6 images of which the hero image of the painting is the first one. And so that's a multi-image presentation that includes that, you know, here's Getty irises as, you know, picture number 1. And then I think about, say, a exhibition catalog in which we include that image, but it's, you know, image number 7 in the exhibition. If we were to annotate that picture of that painting with some content, we'd want that annotation probably to carry through in both of those contexts. And so we could say it's the same canvas, but it appears in slot 1 of the collection and then slot 7 of the exhibition catalog. Mm-hmm. We could also create a manifest that contains just that one picture and use that in a viewer as well.
But there's limited utility in wrapping each canvas inside a manifest? You can't, I guess that's what a collections is for, is to assemble multiple manifests together, but not a manifest of manifests.
Well, it depends on what, you know, to what I was mentioning before, it depends on what you assign to a manifest and to a canvas. So if you're trying to kind of build a structure that's consistent across your whole your collection, it might make sense, even if it sounds redundant, because then you have room to expand. For example, if you have multiple canvases coming later, if you do, you know, second, you know, further digitizations of materials around that manifest, you can add them later. If you don't build that room ahead of time, it will be harder for you to maintain persistent identifiers, and you have to redo, you know, most of your structures. So it depends a lot on your long-term strategies in terms of content. But, you know, building up space is not almost always good.
Yeah, and I think this only causes problems if you are using annotations widely. If all you care about is making sure that you can display images and the presentational metadata next to them, I don't run into this problem, because you can have as many manifests that annotate that image API as you want. It is when you start wanting both the image and annotations associated with that image to be reused across multiple places that we start running into this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I still, from a practical point, I would see it a lot as a data modeling and data management question. Because, yeah, I mean, as you said, so the difference between the manifest and the canvas is that the same canvas can appear in multiple manifests, whereas the manifest cannot. And if you just say, well, how can I attach metadata to that image? And if the manifest is only there to attach the metadata to the image, then that may not be the best way, because you can have multiple ones, but also you could have different metadata for the same image. So I think, at least to me, conceptually, the thing is the identifier that's important, so that you can, if you choose to identify, well, this is the same image in this canvas, in this manifest, although it has a different context or somebody else has created it. Whereas if I don't care about what somebody else does with the same image, then I just create my own manifest. So I would say, yeah, for your infrastructure, it would be, I think, great to say, well, for this image, we have this canvas identifier. And when somebody creates new annotations for this canvas, we store this with this identifier, so that if we choose to, we could grab all the annotations from all the different sources that created them and put them together. But yeah, I think, of course, it does not make sense to say, well, then we have the one mega manifest that always holds all the information about this one canvas in one place, because yeah, that's not, I think that then goes too far. And saying, yeah, it's not really necessary to treat the manifest. It's a presentation thing. It's not really, it's not a data storage thing. So I think it's about, yeah, identifying your images. And then if you're thinking about your image as something identifiable, then why not use that as the canvas identifier?
Yeah, so I agree. Technically, I don't think there's a particular challenge about the annotations, because we can mint as many identifiers as we want. And we already have, of course, identifiers for the canvas and the content which is painted onto the canvas. Hopefully, there are identifiers in a semantic space as opposed to the presentation layer of the IIIF presentation API space. for the object or the part of the object that's being represented that can be annotated. I think the challenge, and in 11 years of seeing this discussed, I've not seen any even close to feasible solution, is getting the user to think enough about what they are annotating to make the selection between I'm annotating the image, I'm annotating the presentation, or I'm annotating the thing. And yeah, that is a UX challenge rather than a technical one.
Yeah, I agree very much that the spec does everything we need to do to talk through all of these issues really nicely. It is a UX question and an internal data management question. I think the other place that it is currently touching is the discovery for humans question. Because I think a lot of that is discovery of resources, and the manifest as proxy for the resource, plus this discussion gets complicated, I think. If we treat the manifest as a very clear representation of a particular object, I'm not sure what I do when I have 6 different manifests, including ones that aren't about objects in my ecosystem space. Do we segment those out somehow into different annotation lists for context? And do we need to communicate that out somehow?
I think, forgive me if I mispronounce it, but Songjun, it brings up an interesting use case, which in the chat, which speaks to context around Canvas, and I don't really know how that could be resolved in an easy and elegant way, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recall the maxim of the presentation API, which is that it's the presentation API. And if you need 2 different sets of metadata, then you have 2 different canvases. And they're about a canvas, then you have 2 different canvases. It is not, we originally called it the metadata API until we realized that we would never succeed in getting anywhere. Because of all the semantic issues. So yeah, in the 99% of the 99% case, a canvas represents a single view of the object. In the remaining 1%, it's a mess and it's unsolvable. But in terms of the discovery aspect, I'd be very curious to know what the Discovery for Humans group are planning. But if it needs to take into account multiple manifests representing the same object, then they would need to solve that semantic metadata problem across all of cultural heritage. So I would hope that they do not attempt to solve that because it would be nice to get something to move forwards.
I agree. I mean, sometimes it's worth using a hack, right? Because we're just talking about presentation. We don't want to build more structure around these entities that is needed for presentation. We're not building a linked data semantic structure. So, but it's definitely an interesting use case.
other thoughts or observations?
I was just thinking a little bit about Rob's comment around, the problem of when does the user have to understand what they're doing and how do we build a UI that supports that understanding, and relating that to experiences with discussions of moving library cataloging from MARC records to linked data. And the experience there is kind of interesting because you have this cohort of people who are extremely experienced with the detailed understanding of what they're supposed to do in MARC, which is a semantically rather impure set of rules because you're writing things, some of which are about the intellectual work and some of which are about your specific item. And there's a lot to be learned or relearned to change the thinking. It's like, now what entity am I talking about? And I guess the observation is really only to say that this is a hard problem.
Yeah. And I think it is the computer vision work that is making this hard for me right now, because it is consistently mutable metadata generated from images that is useful for presentational contexts. And that is not something that I have had to deal with up to this point.
Yes, too. And I mean, also after Rob's comments, I don't see why you want a manifest to represent something. I mean, I can see that from a user point that if you're talking about a scanned book, then you want to talk about a sequence of pages. Which sequence and other stuff, yeah, I mean, let's leave manuscripts out of that, but then you want something to refer to the whole sequence of pages because you want to refer to the whole book, leaving codicology and details about bindings and stuff also out. But so at that point, I see that you want to point to it. But I mean, already at that point, and I think that was also what Rob was referring to, I'm very happy that the presentation API just has this thing called metadata element, which is just key value pairs, because even getting two different librarians to agree on the same MARC elements they want to use for the same book, I'm very happy that we don't go there, and that's why we have an API now and we don't have the one library standard after 50 years. And so, yeah, I would just not cling to the what do we identify a canvas or a manifest with, more than, at least my approach, I would like to see more tools that can use a canvas to then add information that comes from machine learning or whatever, or from outsource things, and then extract those things and put them into new canvases or new manifests. So at least that's my level of looking at the space. But yeah, maybe that doesn't help your problem.
Yeah. And I think the combination of what Nikki was saying and what Rob was saying is, there is a thing that is an image and there are things that are annotations. The canvas is a really nice way to present those grouped together, but it's not a real thing. It's just a presentation. Is a good way to think about it. You need the annotations to be annotating an image, not a canvas is just a way to associate them all together for a particular presentation. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes left in the session. Any last thoughts from anyone who hasn't had a chance to weigh in?
Talking about your last comment, or it sounds like a great summary, but then when you look at it from that perspective, yeah, sure, it's just presentation. I mean, if a canvas is only the combination of an image and annotation in a certain presentation, then it sounds like you want to have a different canvas each time you want to reuse an image in a different context. And I thought the whole point of this was, how can we reuse canvases and not create new canvases? It's not, yeah, I'm not sure what the solution is here, but
yeah, I think it's about the to Simeon's point, or to expand on Simeon's point, about the purity that people want to assign to the identifiers. That if you're okay with the canvas representing the page, and if someone uses it for something slightly different, then that's fine. And if someone wants to throw it into a different manifest, that's fine. If you want it to be exactly representing this page in this context with this exact metadata, then yeah, you're going to have a much harder time finding scenarios in which the reuse will apply. So yeah, it's about how liberal, the more liberal you are with the specifics, the more reuse you're likely to get. If it needs to be very precise, then it's going to be harder to reuse.
Yeah, and where does that work of choosing, upon whom does the labor of making the choice of what contexts are appropriate in this view fall? Is it an authorship problem, or is it a, just ask the user to turn off the views that don't make sense in this particular context kind of problem? Because it's very useful to have a bundle of content, but it's not always going to be appropriate in every context.
Are you talking about the user experience or the data aspect of it? Because I just wanted to also, following the discussion in the chat, talk back to the linked data aspect of it, saying, well, the image or the manifest can be treated as a URI, a resource in linked data, and then I can attach information to that thing. You can attach information to that thing, and as long as I don't know about your information, I'm never going to know what you talk about it, and you don't know what I talk about it. But we can at least, if we choose to agree that we're talking about the same thing. But so at least at that level, I would say it's the same. But if you're thinking about that, well, I have this viewer, and then if I look on the image, I get everything that everybody ever has said or attached or annotated about that image, then of course that's a problem for the user interface. But also I don't see that necessarily coming into that, because you have to put it.
Well, we are at time. I would happily talk about this for hours with all of you, and I'm deeply sorry that we can't continue it over drinks. But thank you all for the discussion and for humoring my what on earth am I going to do with all of this data problem. If anyone has additional thoughts or wants to discuss it at length in other contexts, I'm always happy to have this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you again for the IIIF group for giving me this opportunity.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it up.